Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And this year the NCTC is hosting once again the American Conservation Film Festival. And one of the great perks of having a film festival here in Shepherdstown is we get to meet some of the wonderful filmmakers whose films we so enjoyed. Today we're very fortunate to have in the studio Nate Dappen, whose film Snows of the Nile was one of my personal favorites as a wonderful combination of cultural history and natural history. And Nathan, thank you for being here.
Awesome to be here.
Much appreciated. And I think before we start asking you about the film, we're going to cue up a trailer and show folks just a segment of the film, and then we can talk afterwards about how they can view it.
Perfect. It's a strange thing to visit a beautiful place that you know will disappear. For most of recorded history, the Ruwenzori's have been a pretty mysterious place. Everything about the mountains defied expectations. We just had to see this place. The glaciers of the Ruwenzori's were already 80% smaller than they were a century ago, and some scientists were estimating that they would be gone in less than 20 years.
A lot of times people think that, I'm only one in a billion people, but a long journey starts with one step.
If we could retrace the steps of this 1906 expedition and recapture Vittorio Sela's glacier images, then we could show people how much this place had changed.
So we just saw the trailer from Snows of the Nile, one of my favorite films we're going to have here in the film festival. And we're very fortunate to have one of the filmmakers here, Nate Dappen. And before I turn it over to Nathan to tell us how we can see the film and give us a little background on how it was made, let me introduce folks to your very diverse and interesting background. Nathan is both a biologist and an award-winning photographer and filmmaker. His images, his films, and books have appeared in organizations like the National Geographic, the Washington Post, Scientific American, and the World Wildlife Fund, among many others. He actually has degrees in photography and biology, and he got his PhD in 2012 in evolutionary biology and behavioral ecology from the University of Miami, Florida. Along with Dr. Neil Lowson, Nate founded Days Edge Productions, where he and Neil focus on creating media about science, nature, conservation, and adventure-themed stories, which Snows of the Nile kind of encapsulates all of these themes, and spends a lot of time in the field working on his media. So thanks for being here. I know you're extremely busy, but we appreciate the time. And I think because it was such a good trailer, because it's such a good film, a good place to start would be, how can people see the full film?
There's a couple of different places. If they go to snowsthenile.com, that's the official website of the film. Currently, they'll have to pay for it. It's on Vimeo on demand, and it's on iTunes. But we actually just won a big film competition run by the World Bank called the Action for Climate Film Competition. We won yesterday, third place. So we decided, it was a small cash prize, and so we decided if we win it, what the heck, we'll just make it free for everybody so that more people can watch it.
Very altruistic.
Yeah. So it'll be free online starting Monday. But they can watch it there, or they can watch it on our website, daysedgeproductions.com, or just daysedge.com. And it'll bring them to our Vimeo page, which has all of our videos. And they can watch it there.
Great.
Yeah.
You can also look under the talent section and see
Right.
a more humorous description of your background than I just gave. Well, what attracted you and Neil to this project?
Well, Neil and I had won a film festival run by the World Wildlife Fund. It was just a short little 2-minute piece that we had made for them. And the prize for this competition was a small commission to make another film for the World Wildlife Fund.
Okay.
And we wanted to tell a cool climate change story, and we were trying to think of ideas that people hadn't seen before. Yeah. And so Neil actually came up with the idea of telling this story of retreating glaciers on tropical mountains. People will think of the melting ice caps and polar bears when they think of climate change. nobody thinks of tropical mountains, but there are a few ranges on a variety of continents where the mountains are so tall on the equator that they have permanent ice on the top of them. And so we had a few crazy ideas about going to certain places that were not realistic. And then we started reading about the Ruwenzori Mountains, and I said, hey, I know about the Ruwenzoris. I spent my childhood in Nairobi, and my dad had actually climbed the mountains with Yvon Chouinard, the owner and founder of Patagonia.
Patagonia.
And so he had told us lots of stories and stuff, and so it was a place that I'd always wanted to go. And then when we started reading more about the history and learning more about the Duke of Abruzzi's famous expedition in 1906, which was extremely well documented both in writing and in photographs, we said this is the place. We pitched it to WWF, and it didn't work out with them. They had project that they needed to fund in other places, and so we put the project in our back pocket, and we're just kind of keeping our eyes and ears open for a variety of different funding opportunities. And then the Dos Equis thing came up, and that's
Tell us about the Dos Equis things, because in celebration of that, we actually are drinking beer here.
Yeah.
No, but this is a great story, and it appears in the film a little bit, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. So I was in Denver, which is where Neil lives in Boulder. My business partner lives in Boulder, and we were at a science film festival, and Neil had found out that Dos Equis, the beer company, was running this grant competition as part of their Most Interesting Man in the World campaign called the Stay Thirsty Grant. And the idea was it was a grant program that would fund any idea that was really interesting. And so you created a short little video, which we filmed the afternoon that I was there in Denver together and sent it in. So we filmed this pitch video that we sent into Dos Equis. The judges at Dos Equis, they selected 3 finalists out of the numerous videos that were submitted. Ours was one of the finalists. And then the videos went to a public vote. And so we were, promoting it on Facebook and telling all our friends to promote it. Probably people were sick of seeing and hearing that pitch video, but we ended up winning. And the Most Interesting Man in the World gave us the award. He couldn't appear in the film because of all the SAG agreements and stuff, but they gave us $25,000, and a month later we were in Uganda, climbing the mountains and making the film, and so it was kind of a whirlwind. It was exciting, and we're really grateful to Dos Equis. And for people watching this, they're still running the competition. So I think they're in their 4th round now, and if you've got a cool idea or a business or a film you really want to make, you should check out the Stay Thirsty Grant. It's definitely an opportunity.
I have to say, we've been doing this for 13 years, this film festival, and I've probably seen, 1,500 films. I've never seen a film funded by beer before, and it gladdens my heart.
Yeah, it was really, really great, and they were super supportive throughout the trip. It ended up costing more than $25,000 to do the expedition, and Neil and I did all the post-production for free, but they covered the extra costs of the expedition, and it was just a really great team to work with. Both they helped promote the film, and they were really supportive throughout the process. So it was a cool collaboration.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So tell us about the first expedition, or one of the earlier ones. Who's the Duke of Abruzzi, and what was he doing climbing that mountain in Uganda?
So I knew who the Duke of Abruzzi was before we went on the expedition. He's a really famous explorer, known for expeditions all over the world. He's an Italian duke, of all people. During this period of time, Europe was sort of in a frenzy about exploring the world, and they were particularly obsessed with finding the source of the Nile River. There were accounts, 2,000-year-old accounts from the philosopher Ptolemy, that he had heard from travelers that there are these, ice-covered mountains in Central Africa, and that those ice-covered mountains might be the source of the Nile. And he called them Lune Montes, which are the mountains of the moon. And so people were looking for these mountains for a long time. And in the 1800s, a couple of explorers, including Stanley and Speke, they went to the Ruwenzoris. And the thing about the Ruwenzoris is you can be right next to the mountains and not see them, even though these mountains are bigger than the Rockies or the Alps, because they're always covered in clouds. It's just they create their own weather. They're right, in between Congo and Uganda, and it's an amazing environment, but you never see them. And so nobody knew. The Europeans never knew they were there. So Stanley and Speke went, and they had decided this has got to be what Ptolemy was talking about. The Duke of Abruzzi, he decides I'm going to go summit these mountains. I'm going to figure out how tall they are. I'm going to map them. I'm going to decide, I'm going to figure out whether this is actually the source of the Nile. He gets this enormous team together, and he really wants to document the expedition, so he hires one of Italy's most famous photographers, a guy named Vittorio Sela, who's really famous for all of his kind of expedition photography of glaciers all over the world. They go on this just unbelievable trip. It takes them, 5 months just to get, to the mountains.
Right, to the staging point.
Yeah, to the staging point, and then they spend another 40 days climbing the mountains with the Bakonjo tribe, which is the same tribe that took us up. And in those 40 days, they climbed all the major peaks. Vittorio Sela documented extensively the expedition, and then the Duke of Abruzzi wrote a very detailed account, which, if anybody's interested, they should read it. It's called Snows of the Nile, which is why we named our film that. Oh, okay. And it's just an amazing account of their expedition. He goes into all these details. He talks about, it's one of the few places in the world that has black leopards. He talks about seeing these black leopards, which to my knowledge have not been photographed. Specimens have been found, but nobody's photographed them before. So, but he talks about that stuff, and it was cool. So we retraced his steps and tried to recapture the photographs that Vittorio Sela had captured on their expedition.
How did you get Vittorio Sela's photographs? I mean, as a historian, are they in an archive somewhere? Or?
Yeah, so there's an organization called the Sela Foundation, which is in Italy. He was Italian, and they licensed their images. And so actually, it's a funny story. We had assumed that his images would be in the public domain because he died exactly 75 years before our expedition. So after 75 years, images go into the public domain, private images go into the public domain. So we thought we'd get the images for free. And we had photocopied images from a book of his, and those were our sort of the images that we used to figure out the vantage points to recapture the photos. But when we came back, it turned out that his family had renewed the copyright. And so we ended up having to purchase the images, to license the images for the film. But yeah, they're in an archive in Italy, and so we contacted them, and they have an American office here, run by an office called Decanes Archive. So if people want the images,
well, and you see quite a few of them in the film.
Yeah.
It's stunning. How hard was it for you guys to recreate those vantage points and to find where it was shot, especially since things have no doubt changed in nearly 100 years?
Well,
100 years.
Lucky for us, the Duke of Abruzzi was very detailed about where they were, and so you could find the areas where they were photographing. In some cases, it was easy to find the vantage points, but all the ones that were easy were usually not places with glaciers. It turned out to be extremely difficult. We had no idea that it was going to be so difficult to recapture some of the glacier images, mostly because the thickness of the ice where Vittorio Sela set up his tripod had melted so dramatically, in some cases hundreds of feet.
Wow.
So if you're standing, hundreds of feet lower than he was, there's no way you're going to get the vantage point that Vittorio Sela got. And so in many cases, the images were impossible to recapture. But the few places that you could recapture them were the images that he took on the summits of the mountains. And so we made a big effort to make it to the summits of all the major peaks. We summited 5 mountains, all over 16,000 feet. And those are the images, I think, that tell the best story. The reality was that, Vittorio Sela was there for 40 days. Right. And so for him, he had a lot of days where there was clear weather. For us, 12 days, we only had maybe 2 days where there was maybe a couple hours of clear weather to take photos because it's so cloudy all the time. So we got lucky, and you can see it in the film.
How did you prepare yourself for all the mountain climbing?
Yeah.
You're a scientist and a filmmaker, are you?
Well, Neil and I we both are pretty active, and so we try to stay in shape, but the mountains are a lot bigger than any mountain we had climbed before. The base camp for summiting the big peaks on like the Margarita Peak on Mount Stanley, the base camp's at 14,500 feet, which is very high. Yeah. So as soon as we found out, both Neil and I went on a pretty extreme training schedule. Neil lives in Boulder, so he's already at about a mile high, so he was just hiking and training that way. He actually hiked with beers in his back, in his backpack.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. So he was climbing, and I live in New Jersey, and so I just started running a lot, and I'd go to the gym and put the treadmill. There aren't a lot of hills where I live, and so I'd put the treadmill up high, and I'd put it up really fast, and I'd wear my mountaineering boots and put on a big backpack and go at a high vertical, high speed with boots and a backpack for a couple hours.
Did it work?
It did.
You made it.
Yeah,
you made a
we
wonderful
made it.
film up there.
Well, it was physically challenging. It was a grueling trip, and it's a bizarre place because it's hot during the day. It's like 60, 70 degrees sometimes during the day, and then it's freezing at night. And you're so muddy, and it's wet all the time. It's raining all the time, so all your stuff gets wet during the day, which isn't a big deal. But then at nighttime, everything freezes. And it's such a muddy place that I had mud in the creases of my hands for weeks. Weeks after, I couldn't get them out. I had to literally scrape off the skin on my hands to get the mud out of my hands. So we were really fortunate to have the Bakonjo team supporting our expedition. They carried a lot of the heavy equipment. I'm not embarrassed to say that I'm glad that we didn't have to carry the really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But we were hiking with 40-pound packs, and they were carrying like 80-pound bags and stuff like that. So they're just beasts out there. They're such strong guys.
How hard was it to keep your equipment clean and running in those adverse conditions? You had film equipment and photography equipment, presumably.
Yeah. Well, we shot the whole thing with Canon DSLRs.
Okay.
So our video
Which
equipment.
is interesting. I never would have guessed that.
Yeah. They're great. The 5D Mark III
Yep.
and Mark II they just take beautiful video as well as great images, and so we could take photos and video with the same camera. And they're small, so you're not carrying heavy stuff. We brought light tripods, a couple of small jibs and dollies, and we traveled as light as we could, but keeping things dry was a huge challenge. And there were just long periods of every day where you could not film. And so we got a couple of sponsorships too from Think Tank, and to keep things dry so we could try and shoot. But it's just such a challenge, getting it all out. And once it's raining hard there, it's raining really hard. You can't put a piece of equipment in waterproof gear in the rain. Right. So that was a challenge. But we ruined a few pieces of equipment. Luckily, those were ones that Dos Equis bought us. So,
Good.
Yeah.
Tell us about the local peoples there, because it's actually quite a bit of the film, and it's a fascinating story.
We would have loved to make the Bakonjo a more central part of the film. We wanted to make the film a 20-minute film, so we didn't have to compete with the feature-length films in the festivals. We thought they'd get more exposure that way. But the Bakonjo were a really amazing team to be working with. It's a tribe of people who there's a group that lives both on the Congolese side and on the Ugandan side, and they've been the gatekeepers of these mountains for I don't know how many years, but many hundreds of years. They were the same tribe that took the Duke of Abruzzi up. Yeah. In fact, some of the members of our team think that their their great grandparents were part of the team that took Vittorio Sela up on that original expedition. And these are just some of the toughest people that you can imagine. On the fifth day of our expedition, one of our porters got altitude sickness, which is not uncommon, and it's not the type of thing. Getting altitude sickness, you don't get less prone to getting altitude sickness the more time you spend in the mountains. And so he got altitude sickness, and they had to shuttle him down. And we were supposed to summit the highest peak the next morning. We were going to wake up at 4 and climb. By the time our porter got down, the Rwenzori Mountain Service sent another porter up. He climbed in one night in the dark what we had done in 5 days. Arrived at our base camp at 14,500 feet. He came from around 8,000 feet to 14,500 overnight, going through bogs. I just don't know how he did it. And then wanted to summit the peak with us, which is about 17,000 feet. So our expedition leader didn't let him do it. But these are really tough people who have been instrumental in exploring these mountains, and who I think are probably the largest stakeholders in what happens to the mountains.
How do they make a living there? It looked pretty rough territory.
Yeah.
From the film.
Well, nobody lives in the park.
Right.
They mostly live in a small town called, not so small, a large town called Kasese, which is sort of at the foothills, right below the foothills of the Rwenzoris. And Kasese is not just Bakonjo now. There's a lot of people from a lot of the different tribes who have moved there. So people make a living farming. They make a living working in shops in town. I would say most people live in the area on subsistence farming, which has been affected largely by climate change, as have everyone in the tribe. So one of the really interesting things that we didn't include in the film that we would have loved to is the effects of climate change on disease in the area. Yeah. So this is a really high altitude town. It's over 6,000 feet. Never had mosquitoes until about 20 years ago. As temperature increased in the area, mosquitoes that existed lower moved up in altitude, carrying malaria. And so now malaria is really prevalent in the area. The fact that the glaciers are smaller means that less rain gets caught up in the glaciers, and there's a lot more flooding. And so there's a lot more erosion, which makes agriculture a little bit more difficult in the lowlands. And climate change has also affected weather patterns. And so there is more erratic rain, and it's stronger sometimes and weaker other times. And so that makes planning agriculture significantly more difficult. So people are being affected. The guides are being affected because maybe people are not going to come if their glaciers aren't there. Right. But if you want to see the glaciers, you got to go in the next 20 years because they'll be gone for sure in the next 20 years.
Yeah, tell us what you observed. You were up there to compare the 1906 glaciers to how they exist today. What did you see?
They're different.
And we already heard in some places they're much lower, but were they different consistently on every peak? Or
Yeah, so consistently on every peak they're smaller, a lot smaller. I mean, it's not the kind of thing where you're like, oh, well, it might be a little bit. I mean, they're a lot smaller. On average, it's 80% disappearance since 1906. Wow. So we're talking about major differences. There are only really two big glaciers left. There's one on Mount Speke and Mount Stanley, as opposed to in 1906 when all the peaks had glaciers on them. Now Mount Baker has just, I'm not kidding, just a tiny sliver that's maybe the size of this room that's left, which was an enormous glacier in 1906. And as they get smaller, they also melt faster, volume to surface area ratio wise. And so it was pretty dramatic. And it was amazing because it's not just between 1906 and today. The disappearance of the glaciers is happening rapidly. So there's a point in the film that we show where we came across this area on Mount Stanley where you had to come off the Stanley Plateau, the Stanley Glacier, and climb down these ladders onto the Margarita Glacier, onto the Margarita Glacier. And in 1906, they only needed one 6-foot ladder to climb off this one glacier onto another. And they've had to add a new 6-foot ladder every single year since 2006 in order to reach that new glacier. And so now you have to, you see like 8 ladders, I think 7 or 8 ladders to climb down, and there's no glacier anymore at the bottom now. The glacier's retreated up about 30 or 40 feet. So it's changing every year. The ice caves are changing every year. And the Bakonjo talk about how rapidly they change. They say, I was up here a month ago and it was different. Changing fast, and not just the glaciers, the plants, the animals are being found at higher altitudes. It's a place that's going to be, wildly different in 50 years.
You kind of had a unique opportunity there to see how other people react to climate change. What are the Bakonjo? Was that the What do they say about it? Are they angry or sad or mad at us as being a driver? Because clearly they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like Uganda isn't the one who's putting all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that's causing climate change. I don't know if they're mad. I would say they're very aware of it happening. Their world is changing from a disease standpoint to an agricultural standpoint to a mountaineering standpoint. The world is changing dramatically, and I think tropical places are affected a lot more than temperate places in terms of the speed and intensity of climate change, how climate change affects them. They're acutely aware of what's happening, but I think they're not really sure what to do about it, and there's not much that they can do about it, which is sort of the unfortunate thing. And there's also another point in this film, towards the end of the film, where we talk about one of our guides, a guy named Joseph. We were all sitting around in the huts, and he wanted to talk about, and he wanted to know we were scientists. I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't really know a ton about the climate. But he wanted to know from us, from a scientific standpoint, what they could do to bring the glaciers back. And it was emotional for me and Neil. It was a hard, crazy moment. There was nothing we could tell him that.
Right.
There's nothing that anybody can do there to make the glaciers come back. They're going to disappear. They're going to be gone. And when we told him that, it wasn't. He didn't want to hear that.
Yeah.
And who knows whether he actually believed that. But that's what's going to happen. And so they certainly want to make it a better place there. The Bakonjo are really trying to improve the trails. They're really conscious about. There's not a ton of traffic, but there's about 2,000 people that visit the mountains every year. And so they're making sure that, trails are really well maintained, that people aren't walking off trails, that people are using bathrooms and not just going to the bathroom everywhere or climbing up there to make it, if you go to Kilimanjaro is pretty messy.
It's notorious for that.
Yeah, you don't want to, it's not very fun.
And we don't want to see that on
Yeah, exactly. That's for the Snows the Nile part 2.
Let me ask you a question about the process. You guys picked, Equatorial Glaciers and so on. When you choose that as a topic for your films, do you go in with a preconceived notion of what message you want to convey with it, or do you go and shoot and find the story after the fact? I'm genuinely curious because we don't.
Yeah, I know. No, it's a great question, and I think with this kind of filmmaking, where what you find is something that you're going to find while you're filming, you can't go in with a story. We definitely had our preconceived notions about the place, about the people, about the story, and we went in with a variety of shots that we knew we wanted to get. But we also just said we're going to film everything nonstop, and we filmed everything nonstop. And we only had 12 days, and we knew we needed to come back with enough footage and enough photos to tell the story. So, we didn't know what the conflict was going to be in the film. You can't make a very good film without conflict. We knew we were going to have some challenges in the process, and we wanted to identify those, whether it was the physical challenges of climbing the mountains, or whether it was finding the historic images. And we did not expect. It was a surprise to us when we couldn't find the vantage points, and when we realized that the reason why we couldn't find them was because the glaciers were gone. Yeah. And it made perfect sense when we got home to say this is sort of the central conflict of the film is not being able to find these vantage points specifically because the glaciers were gone. So we decided to do that. And I think the trip, the film is really a buddy's trip. It's we've had a few people tell us that, they would have loved to see more about the Bakonjo, and we would have too, but I think at its core, it's really a trip about our experience in the mountains and the way we perceived our surroundings and the people around us to be.
You're guides to this very new environment to most of us. Let's talk a little about your background, because you have a very unique resume, different than most of our filmmakers out here. You began in evolutionary biology and animal behavior.
Yeah. What
did you study exactly for your PhD?
So for my PhD, I studied the evolution and behavior of Mediterranean lizards.
Okay.
Well,
that's a natural precursor to Snows of the Nile.
Right. Yeah, actually, so both Neil and I studied lizards. He studied anoles in Florida, and I studied the Ibiza wall lizard. I studied color evolution and sexual coevolution in this lizard that's super unique, that lives only in Ibiza and Formentera. So it was not a bad place to study study lizards. But before that, my undergrad, I studied biology and photography, and I was pre-med. I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor, and then when I graduated, I moved to Italy for a couple of years. And got a couple of odd jobs doing photography and building boats. I squandered a lot of money that I made bartending in college. Just had a good time, then decided I wanted to go back for biology. I met Neil in grad school. He was doing his PhD at UCLA, and we met in Costa Rica on a graduate field course. And we bonded over photography and science and our frustration about science literacy in the United States and our desire to do more outreach in science. And, we kind of just started making films for fun. We were both serious photographers, and we started making films for fun a couple years after that, and they were terrible, but they were good enough for us to motivate us to keep making them. And then about a year before we finished, we said, let's not pursue a traditional postdoc, and let's do this full time when we're done. And so we decided together to start Days Edge, and spent our last year of graduate school while we were writing our dissertations applying to every grant and competition that we could find to prepare work for ourselves for when we finished. And it was a scary beginning process.
Dangerous trajectory you took there.
But, I think filmmaking, it's not rocket science, right? It's really about storytelling. And so I think that's been the hardest part to learn, is learning the types of things that get people engaged in a story. And, if you watch documentary films, some of the best ones aren't filmed incredibly. They're just simple stories that are filmed on a home camera. So we knew that the technical stuff we could learn. And that's one thing, doing a PhD teaches you to think really independently and learn things on your own. And so learning all the camera stuff has not only been kind of easy, but it's also been really fun. We both love toys, and so our arsenal is always growing. And the hard part is always figuring out how to tell complicated stories, or stories about things that might be boring to some people. So we're still working at that. I think all filmmakers are always works in progress.
Sure. I'm surprised you haven't wanted to make a film about lizards yet.
Well, I do. We have.
They're challenging to film. I didn't see any on your website.
Yeah,
Did I miss it?
yeah. There's like 6 films when we first started about. Actually, the first film festival I won was about my research on lizards. So I really want to make a film about the lizards in Ibiza and Formentera. It's I think it would make a nature hour, like a PBS nature hour. But so far I haven't been able to convince anybody. Maybe soon though. We're probably going to be working on a series of films about anolis lizards in the Caribbean next year with a Harvard professor named Jonathan Lossos next year.
Cool.
So,
and what's interesting about those lizards? What's the catch on that?
Well, Jonathan's research and the research of his collaborators have changed evolutionary biology in the last 20 years. So Jonathan is famous for his discovering all these ecomorphs. So what he finds is in the Antilles, on every island, you see the same kind of anoles. You see these long, slender anoles, which always inhabit grasses. You see these trunk ground anoles, which are always found on the ground in the trunk. They're always the same size. And then as you move up in the trees, you find these giant canopy anoles. And there's a variety of different ecomorphs. And on every island they're the same. But the amazing thing is, all the lizards on each independent island are more closely related to one another than they are to any lizard from any other island. So it's an amazing example of convergent evolution, where due to similar ecology, all the lizards have evolved to inhabit the same kinds of environments. And even though 2 lizards from different islands look very, very similar, inhabit similar areas, have similar behaviors, they are not closely related. So Jonathan he was the one who discovered that's one of the best examples of convergent evolution that we have. And he's also really famous for understanding rapid evolution. So he was sort of the first person who realized evolution can happen really quickly under strong selection, under strong natural selection. And so his research has been really cool, and he's done awesome stuff. He used hurricanes as natural experiments. A hurricane wipes out a small island. He re-inhabits it with lizards and sees how that's affecting their evolution. So very, very cool stuff.
Yeah, very cool stuff. I gotta go back to my background and ask a follow-up.
Yeah.
So is there something about lizards that makes them have more plasticity or something, where they are prone to convergent evolution? Because I've never heard this before.
Well, convergent evolution happens in a lot of different animals, right? So it's like a shark fin and a dolphin fin. They happened, in different times as a result of different pressures, or as a result of similar pressures.
Right.
No, I don't think that there's anything particular about lizards. There's probably
the lizard guy.
There's probably a lot of organisms out there that have a high level of plasticity that selection can, depending on the environment, their bodies will be different. And I imagine a lot of organisms can evolve rapidly under strong selection regimes. When natural selection is really strong, I imagine that they probably can evolve rapidly. I think lizards, the reason why he studies them is because it's one of those few species that exists throughout the Caribbean. So there's a lot of different, he's got a big sample size and that he can compare things to. I think that's the problem. You can find like a pocket of organisms in one part of the world that appear to have evolved convergently or have a high level of plasticity, but then there's like one. You can't really study science if you only have a sample size of one. And so anoles, they're really easy to study in the lab. Yep. They're small, they're easy to catch. You can catch a lot of them quickly. So I think that's really why he studied anoles. But yeah, I don't know. I definitely know that the lizards in the Mediterranean are also have evolved convergently in the same way that the ones in the Caribbean have. So maybe there is something about lizards.
This discussion is a classic example of your challenge. How do we take what seem like interesting scientific discussions about evolution or climate change and communicate it to a public that might not be trained in science? They're highly intelligent, but it's the same challenge of explaining mathematics or other elements to folks who haven't studied it. What tricks do you use to convey scientific theories in an accessible manner?
Yeah, so I think that is the question for filmmakers and storytellers of all kinds, and for scientists who are trying to help the public understand why they study lizards. Basic research it's hard to explain to people why you want to answer these questions. And I think there's a group of people in the public who are curious and they just want to know, but I think that they're a minority. I think that communicating complex science and ideas to most people you have to do through characters. I think people are engaged by other people, and so the trick is to find interesting scientists or interesting characters who are involved in the science and tell the story through them. This varies, I think, a lot, but there's a lot. We teach these workshops. We teach science filmmaking workshops internationally and domestically to scientists. They're these like intensive week-long workshops, and one of the things that we talk about is the science of science communication. So not about how to communicate science, but about what science tells us about how to communicate information and how people consume information, and how when they consume that information they incorporate that into their behavior. Because I think in order to be successful that is what you need to understand to be successful as a filmmaker. As filmmakers, as storytellers, we want to inform people and we want that information to change their behavior to make the world a better place. I think that's what everyone dreams of doing. And so understanding how people consume information is hugely important. And there's a lot of research on this that's coming out, a lot of new research. Historically, there was this idea that communicating science was all about basically just translating complicated information and dumbing it down, and that if we could just teach people information, with that information they'd be more informed and they'd make better decisions. And that idea was called the deficit model of science communication, and it fails every time at predicting how people behave. And so the question is, if information isn't what makes us, it isn't what informs our decisions, then what is? And there's this researcher who's been doing some amazing stuff in the last few years. He's a guy named Dan Kahan from Yale. And he does these survey questions where he takes a bunch of people and gives them a battery of science questions. He gauges their overall science literacy. He says, okay, are you very science literate or not very science literate? And he gives you, on a scale. And then he asks you a different series of science questions. And in general, the probability of you answering a question right about science has to do with how science literate you are, right? But then when you ask a question, and that's what you see. So if you ask the question about electrons or about climate, not about climate, basic science questions, your chances of getting it right will have to do with how science literate you are. But when you ask a question about evolution or a question about climate science, you don't get those patterns. And so what Dan Kahan did is he separated out the results by either religiosity or politics. And what you find is what most people would expect. You find highly liberal people and less than average, than people who are less than averagely religious answering the question in the expected way. And you find extremely religious and conservative people answering the questions in the unpredicted pattern. And so Kahan argues that we have these two impulses that govern how we behave. He says that we're collective knowledge acquirers. We get information from the environment,
Right.
and we're also cultural identity protectors. And so we filter that information based on how we perceive ourselves to be. And what's really clear from the results of his research is that when people are forced to decide on something based on what they know or what they believe, they'll choose what they believe way before they'll choose what they know. And I think that's really important as filmmakers to recognize. And I think, I sort of just realized this, in the last, few months, that I think as filmmakers, as storytellers, our job isn't necessarily to show people more information, it's to change who they are. And that's hard to do.
Yeah.
But I think that's what a goal of a film should be. It shouldn't be to have them walk out and say, I know more about climate change. It should be like, I care about climate change. And so my films, hopefully in the future, will try to incorporate that into the way we tell our stories.
That's intriguing, but from what you described with Kahan, is it even possible? I mean, if they will, especially on some issues, if they'll choose belief, how can your information be more effective? And
yeah, I think that there's a lot of ways to do that. One example is you can show them characters that change their allegiances. You can show them someone who's so compelling that they say, I want to be like that person. Or you can show them characters that break up the link between knowledge and identity. And you can do that, for example, showing a religious person who believes in evolution, or showing conservatives who are fighting climate change in their local communities through a variety of ways. And there are those people out there. We're doing films right now for the World Wildlife Fund about ranchers in the Northern Great Plains who are grassland conservationists. Yeah. And those films are geared, our audience for those films are other ranchers. We want them to see that they can see themselves both as ranchers and be proud of it, and also be involved in conservation. And it's been a very successful campaign that WWF has been running. They have opened up a conversation with a community of people that the conservation community has labeled an enemy to the environment historically for a very long time, and it's created relationships that previously did not and could not exist.
They're very thoughtful films, and that is on the Day's Edge website. I found those spot on with what we're doing. They're open spaces, and a lot of these guys do have cultural heritage that appreciates wildlife, so thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Well, it was a wonderful opportunity to work with a group of people who I knew nothing about. So I went in pretty naive with my notions. As a liberal person, I was pretty guarded.
Coming from New Jersey.
Yeah.
You really were the fish out of water.
We were, and you definitely didn't want to bring up politics at the dinner table, but all in all, this is a group of people who care a lot about the environment, and maybe, we differ on a lot of opinions, but they care about the same things that we care about, and it was a cool opportunity to work in the Northern Great Plains.
What project are you working on now?
So right now, we're wrapping up a few projects and starting a couple new ones. We just this week signed all the contracts for our first television hour, which will be on the Smithsonian Channel.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a film about speciation, so how new species are born, and it's a film that follows the research of a really passionate, cool scientist who is really finding some amazing things out about how new species are born in the Solomon Islands. So a really remote place, and also a historically really interesting place. It's the place where the father of speciation and of the modern synthesis, Ernst Mayr, sort of came up with his ideas, and where the famous Jared Diamond came up with a lot of his ideas studying birds and stuff like that. So Ernst Mayr was one of Jared Diamond's advisors, and so together they produced a ton of incredible research, and our main character is picking up where they left off, and it's just a cool story, and we were thrilled to have the opportunity to finish it with the Smithsonian Channel. They've been great, and it'll be broadcast in 2015, and I think we have a trailer if you guys want to show that.
We'll go out with the trailer.
Yeah, I'll go out with the trailer.
that sounds fascinating. Is there something about the Solomon Islands you think that generates brilliant theory-defying evolutionary biologists?
Yes.
What's going on there?
I do think so. So one of the characters in our film, you won't see it in the trailer, but one of the characters in our film, he's an evolutionary biologist at the American Museum of Natural History. He says that the Solomon Islands is the Galapagos that Darwin was looking for.
Oh, cool.
So the Galapagos are really cool, but they're super young, and actually they're not that great for studying evolution. But the Solomon Islands, they are a generator of new species. It's a huge archipelago with over 1,000 islands, and they're far enough from the mainland that they're extremely isolated, but they're close enough to the mainland that it allows for new species to come and inhabit the islands. And so the combination of distance and isolation, so the combination of isolation and infrequent migration from the mainland results in species having time and space to evolve independently. And the diversity of islands also allows, for all these cool dynamics to happen. So you've got, some of the highest bird diversity on the planet. You've got kingfishers, that biggest kingfishers in the world, kingfishers that never eat fish. You've got, just these amazing flightless birds. You've got all these crazy birds out there that people have never seen. And it's also a very poorly studied place. I mean, if you go to some of the remote islands, some of the insects you see, they'll never have been described before. And so Ernst Mayr, when he first went there, he saw these patterns of diversity. He saw birds on each island that looked similar enough that he was like, these have got to be closely related, but they were also different enough that he said that maybe they're becoming new species. And so he started, this was really the first time before this, nobody was really thinking about species. So Darwin, he figured out how species change over time as the result of natural selection, but he never described how one species becomes two.
Right.
And it was really not until Ernst Mayr came along and he started looking at these patterns of bird diversity in the Solomon Islands and saying, gosh, on the other island, that bird had a white patch, and on this island, its whole head is white, but the rest of the pattern is the same. And so we started thinking about how all this could have happened, and so really, all those ideas were generated from the collections of birds and other organisms that he collected on his expedition in the 1920s. And so Al Uwe, our researcher, he's going back and answering all the unanswered questions that Mayr couldn't do because he didn't have the tools.
Right.
So he's bringing in
the next synthesis.
Yeah, the next synthesis. Exactly.
It sounds awesome.
Yeah.
We can't wait to see it. And do you have a title for the new film?
Well,
a working title.
We have our working title is Islands of Creation.
Great.
Yeah.
Great title, and we can't wait to see it. Nathan, we've used up this hour very quickly, so I really want to thank you for taking the time to come here. You're doing a lot of things. You're showing your film. You're helping with our producers campus, and I know you're busy, but we really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank those of you that took the time to tune in and enjoy this quick hour with filmmaker Nathan Dappen and his film Snows of the Nile, and hopefully we can do this again when the next film is out.
That'd be
if you
great.
have time, and we'll go out with a trailer for this forthcoming film about the Solomon Islands, which looks very exciting. So thank you.
Thanks.
As part of our nature as human beings, we always want to know where we came from. There's an old story in the Solomon Islands, a story about how the world came to be. A serpent spirit called Agunua created the land, sea, and sky. He created the first man as a brother for himself. Agunua gave him a single yam and told him to cut the yam into pieces and scatter the pieces on the earth. From the pieces of the yam grew every kind of plant and animal. And that was the beginning of all life on earth. I love a good story, but I'm not sure it happened that way. I think understanding our origins and the origin of the diversity around us is important. Understanding the origin of species is an evolutionary question. Why is the planet so diverse? The Solomon Islands itself is an evolutionary experiment millions of years in the making. Right when the sun is rising and the sun is beaming through these emerald leaves, it really gives me the sense of where I came from. It really does have this sense of inexplicable homecoming. New species are coming into existence. That single mutation, that single change in a single protein can have a dramatic cascading effect so that all of a sudden you have a new species.